Thanks very much. My name's Erik Jensen. I'm the editor of the Saturday paper, and I think my expertise for this session is a book I wrote called Acute Misfortune, which is a biography of a painter named Adam Cullen who died at 46 from the ravages of alcohol and heroin addiction. But this session is called Addiction and Creativity, and hopefully in the next hour we're going to chart that peculiar intersection between those two things. The fact that so often, in writing at least, when you go to look for those aphorisms around addiction, they often come from people we would regard to be our best writers. And I think across any number of creative fields, there is a peculiar coupling of the addictive behaviour and the creative behaviour, or the addictive personality, I should say. So I'll start by introducing our panel from the other end of the stage. Liam Pieper is a writer and journalist. He's the author of 3 books. Today we'll be circling his first book, which is a memoir. I won't go into too much detail about it, but it's a memoir of his youth as a drug user and petty criminal. I mean, I don't want to talk you up, Liam, but that's.
Thank you, Erik.
Yeah. You'll sense a trend as we go along. Luke Williams has a terrific book that came out recently that's called The Ice Age, that began happily as an article in the Saturday paper. And it's a piece of immersive journalism that seeks to understand the rise of crystal meth use in this country. And as in all good immersive journalism, it does that by seeing Luke explore what it is to become addicted to crystal meth. And then finally, Elspeth Muir has written one of my, I'm not choosing favourites, but one of my favourite books of the year is a memoir of her adolescence and the death of her brother, set not around addiction, but around the addictive relationship Australia as a country has with alcohol. It's a book that travels on the river of Brisbane and on the river of Grog that sort of flows through the country. So, having made those introductions, I thought the best way to approach this session, because quite often in Writers Festival sessions, you're very confused as to the relationship between the topic and what ends up being discussed on stage, or even the people on stage. But I think this is one where everyone has particular expertise. But I'd like to sort of start with each of us looking at 2 definitions or 2 attempts to explain where things come from. And the first is, and I'll let you start, Liam. I'm interested to know where each of you think creativity comes from.
Okay. I think those things are related, but I think creativity, was that the question? Yep. Where that comes from, I've got no idea. If I had a better idea of where it was, I would write books more quickly. I don't know. For me, it's a process of constant plagiarism, and hoping I don't get caught. No, that's just jokes. That's just jokes, people. I don't know. It's like Gore Vidal has a very good. I could talk about creativity as it applies to writing, because that's kind of what I do. But Gore Vidal, who's a fantastic writer, has a kind of a taxonomy that he divides writers into. There are those who are drawn to it because they love words and language more than anything else, and they're always kind of in a quest for the perfect sentence, for the perfect thought, for the perfect articulation of the human condition. And then there are those who are drawn to it because of some sort of wound, some sort of ephemeral damage that was done to them at some point through their life. I'd like to think I'm the first, but whatever. I think that maybe that's where my creativity, such as it is, came from, because of certain life events that I think that's common to many writers. Something comes along during your life that discombobulates you, that fundamentally shifts your point of view and your way to relocate yourself and learn how to navigate through life again is to write through it and kind of think about life in new ways. And I think in a very loose way, that's kind of where I learned how to do what I do.
Mm-hmm.
If that answers your question in any way.
It
We're already
does.
lost. Great.
No, I mean that's certainly true. So much writing is about trying to explain. As soon as you start to put ideas on the page, you are, by virtue of fixing them there, making small inroads into explaining what each of those things mean. And so it's not surprising that there are often traumas that precede that desire to explain. But I wonder, Elspeth or Luke, if you wanted to add to the first part of that question, that notion of where creativity actually resides or where it comes from.
Well, in my case, I feel like creativity is very much tied towards productivity and towards ego and wanting to put together a product that people are going to read and that is going to give me status and is going to give me rewards. I don't feel compelled to be an artist or compelled to write in the same way I was addicted to drugs.
The question wasn't about honesty, where honesty comes from. We're talking about creativity. It's a very different kettle of fish.
Yes. So, to me, it is very much tied with my ego and who I want to be.
Yeah, entirely sensible response. Elspeth, do you?
Well, I thought long and hard, and I think that my creativity comes from patterns. So I think that I'm good at connecting things that other people might not see. And that's really excellent when I'm writing metaphors, for example, and I can, I don't know, compare a river to a snake, which is that's obvious. It's a terrible metaphor to use, but in that way, I think it's useful as a writer to be able to see patterns, and it's not useful when it gets out of control, which it often does. And I find patterns that perhaps don't exist, and that contributes to a low-level sense of anxiety that accompanies me through life. And I think perhaps that anxiety is also tied to addiction or a need to alleviate that through substance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that is perhaps why creativity and addiction are tied for me.
And paranoia too, possibly, as well.
Totally.
Speaking for myself.
Yeah.
Like you're really attuned to things that will make a story, but then the story gets too big and you're questioning whether the person you just met online is a pedophile, and you're like, that's a really crazy thought. It's probably not true. And I think I'm...
Particularly because it was an email about this session that I sent.
But it would make a terrific story, right?
Exactly,
even if it's not... Imagine that.
Yeah.
And just to tie that off then, Liam, do you have a view about where addiction comes from?
Addiction. Well, yeah, it's actually I was talking to a neuroscientist about this the other day, because in the wake of my memoir about a dissolute youth, I realised I rapidly needed to rebuild my reputation if I was ever allowed onto the grounds of a school again. So I did this kind of long investigative piece about like what addiction is, and the answer, I found a neuroscientist who kind of, I wanted him to let me off the hook and just explain it to me, and he more or less did. He's just like, well, it's it's a brain disorder in its fundamental sense. It's your brain being set up to for a dopamine release. You get used to a certain light bulb going off in your head that makes you feel good, and then over time that stops working, and so that addictive mechanism just becomes a part of you after a while. Some people are more susceptible than to others, in the same way that some people are more susceptible to schizophrenia or bipolar or that sort of thing. If the correct factors introduced to your life, it can take off. And I got really excited when this doctor told me these things. And then I sort of, sometimes when you're doing a story for a paper, you really want a particular quote from a person. You go into it with the story already written, and you just desperately need them to confirm your opinion regardless of the truth. And I really, really, really wanted him to just say, I asked him whether drugs should be illegal. And I really wanted him to say, no, they shouldn't be. You're not a retired petty criminal. You're a national hero. But instead, I kind of kept asking him the leading question. And then he said, yes, drugs should not be illegal. And then I was like, he was like, but drug dealers should be in prison. I was like, and then he's like, but I don't think drug addicts should be punished for their condition. I mean, legal punitive measures should have no place in that level of addiction. And besides, when you take drugs, they have their own punishment built in, and that's called Tuesday. Which I was tickled to hear from a professor of brain.
Elspeth, something that flows from that is our willingness to actually name addiction. And I think your book circles this in particular. So many of us drink in a way that is harmful, that medically we are told represents addictive use of alcohol. So few of us describe ourselves as addicted to alcohol. And I don't know that anywhere in your book, and if you could tell us a little bit about your brother's place in your book, but I don't know that anywhere in the book you want to, or you do, try to name what your brother's relationship with alcohol is.
My brother wasn't addicted to alcohol, so he could go for long periods of time without drinking, and he was fine. When he drank, he drank destructively, so he abused alcohol, and the consequences of that for him were that he would black out or he would disappear, and he wouldn't know where he had been. And I was careful about not ever labelling his drinking as addiction, because I wanted to point to a pattern in the drinking culture, definitely, that I was in, which was of alcohol abuse. So that was binging, and the definition of that is drinking more than 4 standard drinks on one occasion. And I didn't want to call it an illness because it wasn't, and that has different implications for the discussion. So that was why I was careful about never calling it alcoholism, because it wasn't. Yeah.
Sure. I wonder, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to read at different points, just because I feel like it's always a shame to hear writers talk when they're writers, and they should read instead. So, Liam, if I could ask you to read, to carry us through to our next bit of the conversation, and just to say that Liam had asked if he could read a bit of his book wherein he contracts a kind of highly contagious skin infection on his penis and has a doctor try to burn that from him while offering some of the manual stimulation necessary for the turgidity of that medical procedure. I asked Liam not to read that bit of the book because I didn't think it was relevant to the conversation we're going to have. So hopefully Liam's going to read a slightly different bit of his book.
I do think that's highly relevant to this conversation about addiction, because sex addiction is a thing where you can catch these diseases. I found a doctor in LA who told me that as well. If you look hard enough, there's a quack who can justify anything you want. Okay, thank you for that semi-turgid introduction. That was very, very wonderful of you. Okay, as we join our hero, which is me, I'm a sleazy, low-rent drug dealer who lives with his mum in a Melbourne suburb, and I've been dealing drugs for a couple of years. in a kind of low rent way to put myself through high school, and I'm going out with a girl from a wealthy religious college in Melbourne, whose name was Sarah LaBelle. That's kind of all you need. That's pretty much the whole half of the book. So now if you buy it, you can just skip straight to page 130. Okay. Oh, and when this chapter begins with me, my parents and Mrs. LaBelle's and Sarah LaBelle's parents had never met because cultural differences, religious differences, class differences, all sorts. And finally, we'd been going out for a long time, and this was when I finally introduced them to each other. At 10:30 that night, Mrs. LaBelle parked out the front of the house and knocked on the door. I ushered her into the hallway where my parents stood, freshly scrubbed, clear eyes in their eyes. Do you guys know what clear eyes is? Yeah, I bet you do. God bless you, Byron Bay. And there was a round of handshaking and awkward smiling. Dad cracked a dad joke and Mrs. LaBelle nodded politely. For a couple of minutes I thought that maybe the whole thing wouldn't be as difficult as I'd feared. I was congratulating myself on orchestrating the perfect rendezvous and thinking that I could leverage my newfound diplomatic nous into some sort of high-powered career in the Foreign Service when the police raided. I don't know how much you all know about police procedure, but generally, like when they raid like that, they'll have been watching the house for a while, and so they'll watch and they'll keep records of number plates and clients. And that. Do we have any police in the audience? I would hate to tell you how to do your job. So then the police, they wait for like the big fish, and then they pounce, and so when this rather modest street full of beat-up Holdens and Toyotas, when Mrs. LaBelle pulled up in her nice Saab convertible, they were like, "That's our gangster." The police came to my house in greater numbers and better armed than, strictly speaking, they needed to be for Mrs. LaBelle. A heavy-set man in a polo shirt advanced up the driveway. I saw him coming and left my parents and Mrs. LaBelle making chit-chat to meet him. Thinking he might be a lost client or a friend of a friend or a referral come to buy a bag of weed, I thought I'd head him off and avoid trouble. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Are you Liam Pieper?" he said. "Yes, I am, but this is not a good time." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." Just before he grabbed me, I caught a flash of the Lacoste logo on his shirt, and my heart sank. I'm not sure when or why the undercover officers of the world decided that the mid-tier designer polo was the cloak of urban invisibility. But every time a cop has sprung out of the shadows at me, it's always been there, faithful as a hound, that fucking crocodile. Poor Mrs. LaBelle. She was just being polite, going through the motions of making nice with my parents, passing the time until Sarah dumped me and married a doctor. She was not expecting this. 1 minute it was all, "Isn't it unseasonably cold, Mrs. LaBelle?" The next it was, "Where's the dope, bitch?" The police, after charging her down, realised that this 40-something divorcee was not the drug lord they'd been angling for, were disappointed and let her go. I don't know who was more surprised, Mrs. LaBelle, who found herself suddenly being given a pat down by armed cops, or the officers themselves, who dumped out her purse expecting bags of pills, only to find travel packs of sugar-free sweetener. Mrs. LaBelle gathered up Sarah and stormed out as I stood staring sadly after them. This was going to be hard to explain.
My next question flows on from that, and it's
Is it
for all
about
of
my
you.
penis again?
It depends how you answer it, Liam, because the question is, when is it in your life, and for each of you being quite young, when is it that you decide you should write a memoir? Is there a moment, and for two of you it kind of circles around addiction, is there a moment where you decide either I should keep doing this because it's going to be worth writing down at one point, or I need to stop doing this and I should write it down?
It didn't occur to me to write it down until well after the fact. I'd always harboured secret ambitions of maybe being a writer one day, but I never thought that I would write about that sort of aspect of my life. I was very much of this, I was that dumb teenaged boy who read Jack Kerouac at precisely the wrong moment, so that it kind of exploded like a daisy cutter bomb and leveled any ambition that I might have had to be a productive member of society. And I was, that old myth that he wrote on the road, in 3 weeks on a Benzedrine binge. That's kind of true. He wrote something in 3 weeks on a Benzedrine binge, but then he edited it for another 12 years before publishing it.
It's a long road to Tuesday, is what you're saying.
Yeah. That was a big Monday. So I think I bought into that very much, which doesn't answer your question at all. The question was, when did I decide?
But it almost certainly opens up space for Luke to explore. I mean, you have a different circumstance, which is you went in as a journalist looking for a story and then got a little bit lost.
Yes, that's a very nice way of putting it. I wanted to write a story about Australia's underclass, and I knew people who lived in the outer suburbs of Melbourne who were very interesting people, who had great lives and had a lot of fun, and it seemed to me that those were the types of stories that weren't being told, that should be being told, and that there was a very kind of middle-class perspective coming across in Australian media and most books. And what I found when I moved in there was that it wasn't as rosy as what it seemed from the outside of my spending weekends with them, and the drugs were impacting their lives in a way that I hadn't imagined. And yes, I used drugs when I was there. I was taking crystallised meth. I didn't realise that it was crystallised meth. I'd taken powdered meth before, and descended into psychosis and addiction.
And given that you had gone in with the ambition of writing about this, was there a point in your addiction that you thought that what you were doing was in the service of the story?
No, because after about a week of being there, I became very grandiose, and I believed that, first of all, I started working on a fantasy novel, so I put the other idea to one side, and then following that, I started believing that I was going to become a rapper, and that I was receiving telepathic messages from somebody in London, and they were sending me lyrics from songs. So
This is the standard first week for most books.
That's right. And so I didn't have any notion very early on that any of this would make good material. It wasn't until a month after I'd moved out of the house that I realised that I had great material and it could become a book. But I think that one of the problems is being in the midst of that addiction is that you can't see things from other people's point of view, and you can't really tell the other people's stories properly, because you're so self-absorbed when you're in the midst of the addiction and in the midst of your psychosis. So I don't think it would have been necessary to have those experiences in order to write that book, and in some ways I think it probably inhibited me from being able to fully get into the heads of the subjects.
On that front, Elspeth, was there a point after your brother's death when you realised that this was something that you might want to write about?
Yeah, so I had a different experience. My brother's blood alcohol level when he died was 5 times the legal limit for driving, and at his funeral, I come from a big Irish Catholic family, and the way we celebrate any occasion is to get extremely drunk, and his funeral was no exception, and we were all wasted. Everyone was singing songs from The Sound of Music and jumping in the pool, and it was sort of... It was both quintessentially my family and beautiful because that's how they are, and also very sad. And there was no space to talk about alcohol and what had happened with my brother in the way I thought there might have been if he had died of a drug overdose. And that's when I started to think about it. And I was asked to write a piece for the Griffith Review, and I wrote the story of my brother and his death. And from that, I was asked to write a larger piece. So I was initially reluctant to write a memoir. I didn't think I had enough material. But it was something that a few people approached me about, so it seemed something worthwhile to write more on.
Would you mind reading a little bit of the memoir now for us?
No.
Thanks.
So this is about when we were young, my brothers and I. We grew up on a dead-end street in an inner-city suburb. At the southern end, next to a thin horse paddock, was a sluggish, muddy creek obscured by dark green mangroves. Faded creaming soda cans and paddle pop wrappers caught in the aerial roots that stuck out of its dark mud banks, sharp and dense as tongue papillae. The creek had its own smell, sweet and dirty, of hot clay, silt, sulphur, horse shit, eucalypt, grass seed, ducks, brackish water and mould. It was the smell of our childhood, and as I got older, it was stultifying. To a teenager, the dead-end street was a cage. I wanted to touch boys and crack the thick rind of guilt, boredom and frustration wrapped tight around my life, under which everything worth doing bubbled. Drinking seemed the quickest route to dissolving my shyness. For as long as I could remember, Mum had warned us about alcohol. Your dad's side of the family can't drink, and my side of the family can drink too well, she would say. She was one of 12 children. When she was young, they would peel wine labels off bottles and paste them to the cellar walls with their father. My grandfather was a big man with a white moustache and soft white hair that ran in finger waves across his scalp. He was irascible and intelligent, charming and divisive. He adored women and children as people to be petted, was wary of teenagers, and respected men. We called him Papham. He called us woofy farts. When Papham visited from Adelaide, he started reading Mum's stash of Mills and Boons or Harlequins and drinking whiskey at 11 in the morning. He didn't stop except to nap in the afternoon. If Papham was on the piss, which he often was, he was happy, funny and loud. Then he was cross. If he was cross, he yelled at Granny and the whole room flinched, aside from my grandma, who ignored him. One evening when we were putting the dishes away, she said to me, "Never marry a man who drinks." Mum was with Papham in the few days before he died. He couldn't drink, and she thought he was probably going through withdrawal. He could feel imaginary ants crawling up his body and was having convulsions. During his eulogy, my aunt told a story that had been told to her by some of his friends. My grandfather was at a formal party. In the early hours of the morning, when he was too pissed to walk straight, he got into his car to drive himself home. After fumbling around for a while, he was approached by a police officer who asked him politely if he was okay. My grandfather looked up at the policeman and said, "I'm very glad you're here, officer, because someone has fucking stolen my steering wheel." The policeman looked at him and said, "You're in the back seat, sir." This was long after we had left home, but Mum's warnings didn't make a difference anyway.
It's almost impossible to talk about books that deal with alcohol, drugs, or addiction without also talking about family, because I think family are the great victims of any addiction. And I know family feature in each of your books, and certainly Liam and Luke, family feature in your books in ways that are somewhat unexpected, I think. And so I wondered, maybe starting with you, Luke, if you'd talk a little bit about writing family, and presumably this is the first time your family had seen themselves in the pages of a book. The sort of decisions you make, but also given that you had recently been a difficult and addicted person in their presence, whether or not you found yourself trying to repair some of the damage you might have done to that family, or if conversely you wanted to punish that family.
Well, yes, probably the second one. I wanted them to see the mistakes that they had made and give them some proof about things that they were still in denial about, as if somehow the fact that I'd written it down on paper would be proof, and say, look what you've done, look what you've missed, look what you've ignored because of your own addictions and your own illnesses, that you haven't seen the damage that you've done to me. And a lot of it was edited out because the publisher was concerned that it would make me a lot less sympathetic.
He
that
says
I
to
come
the
across
silent
as
room.
the spoiled brat that I'm often accused of being, and not being able to see things from other people's point of view. And of course, when I was writing the book, I was coming out of addiction, which makes it very hard to see things from other people's point of view. So I did threaten my parents during the book, and I just said, just wait till the book comes out, then you'll be sorry. If you don't like some of the things I'm saying now, wait till I put them in the book, because my parents kicked me out of their house when I was withdrawing, because I got into some trouble when I was up in Bundaberg, and I was sleeping outside for a little while and had to go and see a social worker, and got this good story out of it by staying at the Gatwick, which was made to look like I purely just went and stayed at the Gatwick to chase a story, but actually I stayed at the Gatwick because I had nowhere to live. But I like it rough, so that was fine. And so when all that went down, I sent them a nice email saying, you realise all this is going to be in the book now, don't you? You realise. And they were like, oh, well, they'll see it from our point of view, I'm sure. They'll realise what a horrible little shit you are. And so, yeah, it all got toned down.
I realise writers are the last people in the world who talk about Freud. I think anyone from a medical background or a psychoanalytic background even probably rejects Freud, but it seems like as writers we're always writing about our family and our parents in particular, and that's certainly true of your book, Liam.
I think maybe we're more into Jung just because he was even worse with symbols and metaphors than I am. But little psychoanalysis joke there. Tough crowd. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I try not to think it's too Freudian, like that because it's hard to write a book about anyone without character assassinating them a little bit, because by the sheer fact of turning a real person into a character that rendered in words on a page, you're presenting a very, well, it's your own perspective, but it's also a very stilted perspective, at least if you write like I do. I'd like to apologise to my publicists at this point. I try not to think it's Freudian. I don't think it was a malicious act on my behalf. But I did want to write, my parents are fond of drugs. And I grew up in a kind of ersatz hippie commune. And I wanted to, part of my book, apart from the turgidity bits, is kind of an exploration of what it is to grow up in a house where, drug use and occasionally abuse is a fact of life. And how when you... I lost a brother to heroin, and when that happens, you tend to just start taking more drugs. You'd think that would be a warning. You'd think you would back away from that, but no, you just go deeper, because at that point it becomes a kind of medicine. So I wanted to write kind of exploring that sort of thing, which some critics have taken as kind of a Freudian act of, assassination of my parents, and a kind of half-eatable thing. But I try not to do that as much as possible. I think part of growing up is you reach a moratorium where you can no longer blame all your problems on your parents. And while because of my upbringing, I didn't think it was a particularly controversial thing to occasionally get high. It's just what people do, right? However, once that was in the media, some more conservative elements of society didn't like that so much. So that was difficult on my folks. These days, they're cool with it. They understand why I wrote the book and what I was trying to do with it. Although my mother is still really hung up. She's furious about this one part where I say she baked us hash cookies for my year 11 formal. And they were cookies. They were like brownies, not cookies. So I'd like to retract that on the record. She's like, I've never baked a fucking cookie in my life. She was quite cross about that. But other than that, I think I did what I could to limit the sort of collateral damage which is inevitable when you write about those you're closest to.
And Elspeth, you were writing, a story very intimately that you shared with your brother, your mother, and your father, and you write quite nakedly about the anger that you had after your brother's death, and where you directed that. Did you at any point feel that you needed to try and repair with the book your relationship with your parents, or that you were trying to do something in particular with the book?
The anger you refer to is the anger I felt after my brother's death, and I write about going through a period where I blamed my parents, and I think that part of grief is you wildly flail around looking for something to blame, and I wanted to show that existed, and also that was absurd. It wasn't their fault. How could they have stopped that? And I think that they're okay with that. I was extremely careful writing about my family. One of my misgivings initially about writing a memoir was that they had already been through this terrible experience, and then writing about it would bring it up again. And so I gave the manuscript to my mother to read before it was published, and she had right to take anything out that she wanted to, and she did. She took a small part out. And I think that the finished product is something they're okay with. I don't know that my father's read it, and he hasn't ever really spoken to me about it, but I think that might be more to do with his grief over my brother, and the way that he deals with that, which is not so much to face it head on, and I don't think he wants to think about that. So he hasn't ever, he's not a particularly loquacious man. We haven't ever talked about my anger towards him, but I think I showed that it passed and that it was a symptom of grief. Yeah.
It's interesting to me that, certainly on this panel because it's been done so deliberately, but more broadly in writing, books find themselves in the territory of excess and addiction more than life finds itself in that territory. And I wonder, maybe, Liam, you've got a view about why that is, but and it's not just because everyone at 14 accidentally reads Kerouac, but there seems to be a propensity for writers to want to navigate, be it in fiction or in non-fiction, those extremes of addiction and of excess. Is it a truer form of the character? Are we hunting for something there?
I think that's just an extension of wanting to explore extremes of the human condition. That's what we do. I mean, unless we're very boring writers, like you want to, whether it's exploring strong emotions or powerful situations, or addiction is an extreme situation. It's an extreme condition to experience, and so perhaps that's why we were drawn to it. There is also, I think, the fact that, addiction, particularly to illegal substances, has a whole world that comes with it, a whole world that comes with crime, and it's kind of mysterious, and it's like the second you drive something a little bit underground, then it attracts a kind of mystery and a glamour to it, and I think perhaps that's why we're continually drawn to it. One of the reasons I wrote this thing is that was actually I'd never really seen an honest representation of drug addiction. Like, I mean, from the way I'd experienced it, like as a family, that kind of thing. It's always so extreme. It's always so like, and then it's it reminded me of in high school there was a drug education van where a giraffe would come and teach you about addiction. Which
he has a name. It's Harold. Let's use it.
I do apologize. Now that I think about it, that's an odd thing to have happened, but yeah, Harold was actually one of the good guys. But a lot of like education programs, particularly there was a government leaf drop during the Howard years where they got tough on drugs, and they were like, if you smoke pot, you'll drop out of footy, and then you'll be in St Kilda, and you'll be a sex worker, and then you'll be in a body bag, and that's kind of not the experience for most people. And so I kind of wanted to try and demystify that a little bit. I also think it's quite dangerous to like cloud it in shadow and mystery and misinformation, because the more you know about the substances and how they affect your body and your brain and your life, the better decisions you can make. If you tell a 14-year-old boy or girl or them that they will that if they smoke pot their life will be over, and they smoke pot and their life doesn't end, they've been lied to, and they realize that, and they're canny, and they start to wonder what else could be untrue. A better, a more honest thing would be like, you can smoke some pot now, but be careful, because if you smoke too much, you'll spend the rest of your life writing a terrible screenplay about the rave culture in Australia. The risk is that it might ruin your life and make you into a boring person, but you won't know about that for 10 years, so just take it easy until then. That's what we should be telling kids about drugs. And I can't remember what the question is, but don't do drugs.
If you were dressed as a giraffe now, that whole thing would have worked perfectly. Luke, I wonder if I could ask you to read now, just to really take on from that same thing, that your book is all about trying to understand a condition that terrifies average society right now. That there's this sense that ice or meth is a drug like we have never seen before, and is destroying whole towns. And partly that might be true, but also the media doesn't always do a very good job of trying to engage with the subtleties of any drug. And if you could read the section that you were talking about reading, which I think takes us to some of the attempts in that book for you to understand not just the drug, but the other people using it. Mm-hmm. Thanks. This is Pinteresque.
No, I can't be bothered, actually.
Right. Okay. There's a lovely passage of the book where you do write about trying to understand the woman that you're in a house with. Moving on from there, I suppose, I'm also keen then to understand about the unreliability of recollection, particularly when you're writing first-hand narratives, particularly first-hand narratives that involve mind-altering substances or any drugs, I should say. I often think of truth as the first casualty of most addictions, and yet certainly Liam and Luke, your books are about wresting back truth from that addiction. I wonder if you could talk to that somewhat, Luke.
About the unreliability of...
About going back through a period of addiction and trying to find truths in it.
Well, I guess it's hard to remember back through a lot of times where you've had psychotic episodes, because it's you have a lot of blackouts during that time. So that's a difficult thing. In terms of addiction, I mean, it was helpful for me to actually be able to write some of this stuff down and get a handle on where I had gone wrong, and break down some of the kind of outdated ideas that I had about the fact that I'd had difficulties in my life, and the fact that I'd had traumas, and but so had everybody, and that in a way led to me for a justification of using drugs, when I actually think it was a case of me needing to sustain an unrealistic idea of who I was, and me using drugs to fill that gap, and to maintain a fantasy of who I was when reality said otherwise. But I think through rehabs and through counsellors, which had focused on me, the difficulties that I've had in life, led to justification for drug use.
And did you come to have different views about your own addiction in the course of writing about it? Was it exploratory in that respect?
Yes. And it's the same with the people who I'd known for a very long time, and to me it was all about maintaining certain fantasies about themselves and about their world, and not necessarily linked to difficulties that they were having in their lives.
Mm-hmm. On that note, I think, given as we've got a little bit longer, I might open the floor to questions if anyone had any questions that they'd like to ask. There's microphones roving, and so they will come to you.
Just a quick one for Liam. When your mother disputed that she could cook cookies, had she put hash in the brownies?
No comment.
Are there other questions? There's one back of the room.
Hi. I don't think the question's been answered. It's a chicken and egg question. Addiction first, creativity later, creativity there, served or not served by the addiction?
Well, I think they could be what's, in medical terms, what's called comorbid. I don't think one causes or creates the other, but I think they come from a similar set of characteristics. Like if you break down the statistics of the kind of people who are prone to addiction, and the conditions that accompany them, such as like bipolar depression is a precursor often to addiction, or like certain dopamine imbalances. They are also the people who tend to become artists. The artists are overrepresented statistically amongst those sorts of conditions. Yeah, so I don't think addiction and creativity necessarily have to exist in the same person, but the same people often show those similar traits. But I think it's very dangerous to link them, because, I mean, like Hunter S. Thompson was a great and visionary gonzo journalist, despite his various afflictions and addictions, not because of them, I think. Like, he would have achieved a lot more, perhaps, if he hadn't been so fond of getting high and shooting guns and whatnot.
But it also helped market him in a sense, didn't it?
That's
It
true.
really gave him an edge. He deliberately pursued that. He wrote Hell's Angels in the 1960s, and that was reasonably successful, but he kind of figured in order to take the next stage in his career is that he could market himself as being a drug addict. And I've found that too, is that, you know, I haven't dedicated myself full time to writing up until the last 2 years. But, you know, people read a few of my things here and there and, oh yeah, that's pretty good. And then the minute I came out, it started saying about I've had psychotic episodes and I've used drugs, everybody suddenly found me really fascinating. But prior to that, nobody was finding anything I wrote particularly fascinating at all.
That's
You know, so I don't think they necessarily do go to... I don't even necessarily think they're related, addiction and creativity at all. To me, they're quite different things.
That's a really good point. The fact
And,
the
and
marketing
addiction is just a compulsion to do something that has no productive end. But creativity does. I mean, we create things in order to produce something, in order to get some acclaim for it. But if you're addicted to something, then you're just doing something for the sake of it. So that they can go together. They don't necessarily go together. To me, there's more of a link in what you were saying in terms of looking at patterns of things. And people with mental illnesses, not necessarily addiction, do that very well, particularly people who suffer from psychotic episodes, is that they're able to make a link between things and create new things in the same way that somebody who is creative is doing, whether they're creating a new sentence or a new image. That, to me, that has a very strong link with somebody who has a tendency to be psychotic. But, you know, in Pakenham and in other areas where I meet a lot of people who suffer from depression and anxiety and psychosis and have had all these terrible things, there's no expectation on them that they become artistes. And they're not, you know, painting and drawing and writing poetry and all this kind of stuff. They're just sitting around depressed and psychotic and taking drugs all the time because there's no expectation on them that they're these tortured artists who have to express themselves and got all these things out there. I don't necessarily see there's a link at all. There's plenty.
I would agree with you, absolutely. I would say this quite clearly, and it's something... My ex-husband died of a heroin overdose, and he's quite a famous addict in his time, as was I also. I've been in recovery for 27 years, but I get disturbed by the link that's sometimes made in the Whiteley studio, for example, by kids kind of saying, hey man, you know, like using drugs will make you a genius. Well, I'd like to disperse that myth as quickly and absolutely possible. It is just nonsense. It's nonsense. For example, Brett was an artist and a creative person a long time before he was an addict. Yes, he did use drugs, and so did I, for reasons, as you pointed out earlier on, you just kind of slide into it in a way, in a naive and stupid way. But I don't know about the glamour attached to it anymore. I think, frankly, I'm sick of recovery literature as much as I'm sick of reading literature about addicts. I'm so boring, you know. If that's the central focus of what... And I keep saying this about Brett too. Who'd be interested in a junkie just dying in a motel room in Thurrool? The fact is that they're interested because he was an artist, first and foremost, not because he was a junkie as well. And anyone who focuses on the junkie side is missing the point. You know, don't use drugs in order to be creative, because they just kill you. And they destroy all of that. And I just wanted to make that clear.
Just one other question was, is creativity then the balm or the medicine that helps the addiction? Is that a link?
Do you want to take this one? I can't beat that.
No. Did you feel that your book, for instance, Luke, was useful in recovery? Which is one way of answering that question, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely, because I was able to see how appalling that I behaved, and I had to be really honest, and I could see what other people were seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, it did help me definitely get some perspective on just what a piece of shit I had been for years and years and years. Definitely.
And Elspeth, if we broaden that question, and it was a question not about creativity being a balm to addiction, but creativity being a balm to trauma or to pain, so much of what is tied up in addiction but also exists elsewhere. Did writing your book offer that?
I think that storytelling is extremely powerful, and that the ability to encase a traumatic event in a story allows you some perspective, and like what Luke was saying, allows you to see traits and characteristics from perhaps the vantage point of a spectator rather than somebody who is involved. And that's a really, I think, a mentally healthy thing. And in that way, creativity is very useful for me. And I think that was what I was getting at when I was talking about patterns and the ability to build story from something that seems chaotic and completely incomprehensible. Being able to mold that is very powerful. Yeah.
And Liam, why not? Do you want to add to that?
I think it's a more positive way to spend your time, definitely. You know, I enjoy what I do. That's why I do it. And, you know, it's, you know, but I take a fairly, what do you call it, pragmatic view of humanity. I think that, you know, the same kick I once got out of snorting blow, you know, you feel good for a minute. But if you work really hard on a book for 2 or 3 years and it goes through rigorous editing and it goes through the world and someone out there reads it and then they give you 3.5 stars on Goodreads, you're like, it feels kind of good too. So,
are you sure you're not trying to edge aside Healthy Harold for his job?
Is that Healthy? So it's Mr. Harold. Mr.
What's Healthy Harold is his name, yeah. You might get to answer further. There's just one more question, and then we're out.
Elspeth? It's a question for Elspeth. Thank you for writing Wasted. It's an incredible book. The end of the book, you talk about the nation's addiction with alcohol, and you start to talk a bit about that. And there's some was quite recent evidence and research you were talking about. I just wondered if you had an opinion or could talk to that bigger picture of alcohol and addiction in Australia.
So you're referring to the evidence that teenagers are drinking less now? Sure. So at the end of the book, I come to the conclusion that I binged drank throughout the writing of my book, and it's not particularly dramatic or anything, but I sort of, in thinking about that, I was like, this is very hard. It's hard to... I think I write about developing compassion for the drinker and the ways in which sometimes perhaps legislation is necessary to curtail the more destructive behaviours that I think are innate in many people. It's a lot of pressure to put on an individual to kind of change their own behaviour, I think, sometimes for whatever reason. I believe what happens, especially with drinking culture, is that often individuals are blamed for their problems rather than looking at alcohol as a problem. And I don't think that's something that happens with drug culture. I think that drugs are blamed for the problems of people. And it's bizarre because they're both a drug, just one is widely accepted and others are not. That's my tentative conclusion. I was listening to a talk with Malcolm Gladwell the other day, who said that he changed his mind about things all the time, and I'm sure I'll perhaps if new evidence comes to light, I'll change my mind again. But I do think that I do think that there's evidence that legislation works, and maybe we should be more open to it. But then I also think that the legalization of drugs is something that we should perhaps be looking at. I read one of Liam's pieces about Portugal and the legalization of drugs there, and I very much agreed with what was happening there and the effectiveness of that. So I'm conflicted, but I think that's just the nature of the drug discussion, and we should be talking about. It's great we can have talk sessions like this. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, that is actually all that we have time for. So if you do want to brave the rain, I suspect Liam and Luke and Elspeth will be signing books. And thank you so much for coming and listening.